Okay, well, without further ado, I'm just going to quickly present our speakers in the third panel, which will focus on the security situation and the impact of that situation in Ciudad Juarez. We're very lucky to have a quite diverse group of panelists today. First, Alberto Islas, who is the founder of Risk Evaluation Ltd. In Mexico City, and who advises both Mexican and foreign companies in Mexico on security risk situations, has spent a lot of time in Juarez, including some time recently. Alberto previously worked in the foreign policy cabinet of President Cedillo. He is working on a documentary on the impact of drug consumption in Mexican society and has long been interested in these subjects. Maureen Meyer, who's an associate for Mexico and Central America at WOLA, the Washington Office on Latin America, has focused extensively on human rights issues in the region and previously worked for Amnesty and Catholic Relief Services in Latin America and the Caribbean, and has been writing about human rights in the Mexican security situation, particularly as involves the military in recent years. Alfredo Corchado is the Mexico bureau chief of the Dallas Morning News. He's one of the most experienced and respected American correspondents in Mexico, and as anybody in that job would have done, but more so, has written a lot about drugs and crime along the border. He was a Maria Morse Cabot Prize recipient in 2007, and he's now a Nieman Fellow at Harvard. We're going to start with a presentation by Alberto, and then we'll have remarks from Maureen and Alfredo, and then get into a conversation.
Hi, thank you, Tim, and thank you for having me here. I will just have a couple of slides just to give you an overview of what the feeling of Juarez is and a little bit of putting things into perspective. First, here you see that 100 years apart, the events are very similar, and this was taking into account the history and taking account into the context. In 1909, you had the first meeting between President Taft and President Porfirio Diaz. The meeting was in Juarez. You had weapons, customs violence. In last year, you had the same meeting with President Obama, but for security reasons, it wasn't being able to have the same meeting in Juarez. But the themes were probably the same, but the context was different. You had threats and attacks to the U.S. consulate, bomb threats at crossing points. You had an arms reduction initiative, and you had a violence of outbreak that would happened. In 1910, after this meeting where President Taft asked President Porfirio Diaz to do something about the violence spillover that had happened back then, you had the General Pershing incursion for Francisco Villa with around 4,800 troops, now which was unsuccessful. In 2010, you had threats to the U.S. consulates, and you had diplomats that are murdered. We could argue right now that this is probably the same scenario, and in 100 years nothing has happened. But our assessment is that 2010 is much more violent. And why is it much more violent? And this is taking a little bit of what Diana asked a couple of minutes later, that is this an insurgency or not? I mean, it's not. I don't think it's an insurgency. It is a terrorist event. And this is something that we have been seeing, but we have not been able to call these terrorist attacks. Here, and these are more challenging to the state. As had been talked before, just to look at the numbers, here you have the homicides per 100,000 people, and we were talking about the crack epidemics before, and here you see in New York and Chicago, where at that time, between the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, you had 30 to 33 people assassinated, homicides per 1,000 people. In Sicily in 1989, which was a big breakthrough against the mafias, was around 14. In Medellin in 1991, which was the big incursion, you had 133 homicides. Last year in Ciudad Juarez, you had 110. So this is something that I think it gives us a sign of the importance of the magnitude of what's happening in a city. Organized crime has monopoly power. I mean, it is challenging the state. Why? The basic functions of the state, if you're a socialist, capitalist, communist, or whatever type of government, is giving protection and collecting taxes. Organized crime is collecting taxes and giving protection in different parts of the states. And now, as Alfredo will probably build upon later, also taking the role of censorship, of saying who can say what and when they can say it. And this has been an overpowering of the state from local authorities, state authorities, and federal authorities as well. What did we miss in Ciudad Juarez? This is a country, a city that has a lot of contrasts. And here we can see the different points that people are talking about creating a strategy, building a new movement, taking into account social participation. But here we can really see the different points when you really, and I think that policymakers and people taking things into account should go to Juarez and at least stay some time there. Here we have that 70% of the Mexican exports to the U.S. pass through Juarez, but 75% of the city lacks pavement. High-end manufacturing plants coexist without 20% of the households that have no electricity. We have high labor productivity with 60-day contracts for employees and no social benefits. I mean, this is a very mobile workforce, but it's mobile because the maquilas and the employers are hiring for very short periods of time. We have only 5 hours of school for teenagers. There's a lack of urban planning. It's a city that has 2 public transportation routes, and it's a city that we don't have enough pavement. And here, what we are creating is all the incentives for people to participate in organized crime, because people do get rich in organized crime, and people that participate in organized crime also face a very low risk. Everybody says that once you go into organized crime, it's very difficult to go out. Well, this is not true. People go in and out in organized crime, because organized crime has also followed a more decentralized level. You don't have just one big cartel or one big company. It's like they function as a business. And like other companies, they do outsourcing and they decentralized. People can work for them selling piracy for a weekend. People can work for them as lookouts for a couple of months. People can work as hitmen for them for 2 or 3 years. And they hire people on a need-to-know basis, and they're very flexible in the structure. So this created an in and out participation of organized crime, which has also allowed organized crime to be more embedded into society with these very specific roles. We have around 5,000 gangs in Ciudad Juarez. Another important point is here the amount of deaths that you had. You had 2,640 assassinations last year in Juarez. Only 10 cases have been resolved, and I think this is a very important part, because it gives you the impunity, and you also start to have impunity at the police level. Imagine what we have at the national security level. In Mexico, at the national security level, hasn't been able to deal even with terrorist events, and terrorist events are like throwing of grenades in Independence Day in Michoacán, which didn't get resolved. The people that were caught were actually let go. You have attacks, for example, the attacks from the EPR on Pemex facilities. Nobody has been brought to justice, and it wasn't just one event; it was 3 times. So this recurring lack of capability to investigate and to bring people forward to justice is also another additional event that I think is very important. And take into account El Paso. El Paso had, in 2009, had 15 homicides. Of those 15 homicides, 14 were resolved, and they have a backlog of 10 cold cases. The cold cases are the same, equal the amount of cases that have been solved in Ciudad Juarez. These are like a price index that you have. You can make from, for example, a hitman can make from $50 to $500 per hit. That's what the street range is in the street. a very important thing is that organized crime, it's the model of business of organized crime is a logistical model. If you take a company like Federal Express or DHL, that's what they do. They are arbitrage between things that are legal into the legal market. And what do they? So it's very important, and they rely a lot on warehouses. They rely a lot on the capability of infrastructure. So what they do is they build a channel. We can make a channel of illegality, and through that channel of illegality, be it you can pass migrants, you can pass bootlegged products, you can pass cocaine, you can pass heroin. I mean, there are a lot of things. Once you open the channel, the marginal cost of bringing in an additional revenue line or additional product is very marginal. So that's why we've been seeing organized crime developing more in Mexico, going into other different areas. So this is really the backbone, what you need to take into account. And one of the things that has failed in the from the Mexican side of you is that they haven't done anything to attack, like Ambassador Sarukan said. He said, we need to increase the cost of doing organized crime business. Well, if you do that, you need to take into account the customs. You need to take into account the logistical framework. And you need to have more information. An example, in the state of Chihuahua, one of the important parts is a state that grows heroin and it grows marijuana. Mexico has been it's the only country that does not report the number of cultivated crop of, and it's an estimation of marijuana and heroin. We have countries like Marruecos that do that. We have countries like Bolivia that do that. And that's a very important part. They do it because they have a satellite. Mexico, for the past 10 years, hasn't been able to buy a satellite. At first, you think, well, maybe this is a bureaucratic process that it's very difficult to get a satellite. I mean, there's the Ministry of Finance won't let the other people buy it, but after 10 years, you say, well, there must be something else. So if U.S. estimates, for example, from the State Department, the report that they give every year, now point out that Mexico is the second largest provider of heroin, of black tar, to the United States. And we've seen there's a very important work from Sam Quiñones that came out around 3 weeks ago from the Los Angeles Times, telling how a small village in the state of Nayarit is now one of the biggest exporters and providers of heroin here in the United States. So, I mean, these are the things that if you don't have a really diagnostic, it's very difficult to provide and build upon policy. In all the countries like Marruecos, Bolivia, Peru, we've seen that first you have an eradication program, but you also have a crop substitution program. And here in Mexico, we don't even know what we do eradicate, and afterward we don't have any crop substitution. There are places like in Michoacán, Apatzingat, in which if you pay $20 for a Google Air View, you can see the fields of marijuana. So it's something that that you need to have information in order to get policy done. Here, just to give you an example, we have 7,000 troops in federal police with 2,300 local police, 2 organizations of local police, an overhaul of customs. Now we have a SAR that coordinates everything from policy point of view on the border. And this has resulted in this year of 2 weapons seized at the border from Mexican customs, because they do sell weapons in the U.S., but somehow I don't know how they get into Mexico. I mean, and one of the things that if going into the United States, you take about an hour and a half in order to cross the border, or 2 or 3 days. And on the other side, if you come to Mexico, you're going to probably take less than 15 minutes. So we cannot have these type of imbalances. We had 15 kilos of cocaine. It's difficult, yes, but there's we could have an estimation, an educated estimation, that there are probably around 80 tons of cocaine that passed through Juarez. It's also something that's very difficult also to, you have to do very good intelligence work, because just to give you an idea, 1 ton of cocaine probably equals the size of a Toyota. So imagine 80 Toyotas crossing throughout the year through that border point, which is a very big border point. So you have to really pinpoint these. You have to pinpoint these things. So yes, it is difficult, but you need to start working on these type of things in order to not prevent this to be a significant cost on the economic side. If you look at the numbers, the rise in violence up to date in Ciudad Juarez hasn't affected the volume of trade. And this is probably another part, because the maquilas that are there in Juarez, the owners of the maquilas and the managers of the maquilas, they don't work in Juarez. So they're just substituting personnel, so it hasn't come to affect their business. Why, if a gang member goes and robs, say, a maquila that makes televisions, everybody's going to know that they have that televisions. But for them, it's more profitable to do an extortion to a member that has a bar, that has a funeral parlor, which has been a very good business recently. There was a piece of that also on the, I think, on the Houston Chronicle. And so what you see is that people are going in and out in order to get to, and are driven by revenue. So violence in the youth is getting driven by revenue. And I think this is, for me, this is very significant. This is a demographic pie chart that was done last year by 3 different groups in Ciudad Juarez. And here you can see that the bulk of the population in the city, it's the youth. And you have youth that have no public spaces. You have people that their heroes are the drug traffickers. They're able to make money. There's a very low risk in participating into that event. And what has happened, I mean, some of the big groups started to pay the gang members with cocaine. When they were paying in with cocaine, what sorted out is that if I have half a kilo of cocaine, and they told me I could only sell it in Mexico to make a 20% margin profit, and I'm able to make it to sell this and cross it over at least half to the United States with my cousin that lives on the other side or a friend of a friend, I'm able to make more money. So you're starting to see 18, 20-year-olds who are able to make in a month $300,000 on illegal trades, and who like to spend the money. You go to see certain houses in Ciudad Juarez, you just need to take the car and travel. You see properties that are probably worth $15,000 on the retail market, and you see that they have a second floor, they have a satellite antenna, they have a BMW outside the door. So it's, I mean, this is the incentives that we're creating in this in this city. And thank you.
It's a great overview. And Maureen, I think you're going to pick up a little bit on the human rights side of this and going back into the history of that.
Thank you, Tim, and thanks to the New America Foundation and the Mexico Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center for the invitation. I, as Tim had said, and what I was asked to speak about was a little bit more on the human rights side of what's been happening in Mexico. And I think taking a step back and looking at the title of this whole panel on Has Mexico Turned the Corner, I think in the area of human rights, and having worked on it for over 10 years, several years in Mexico City with one of the local organizations, I think what we've seen is that internationally, Mexico has had a much better view or perception on human rights. They've adhered to a lot of international protocols, human rights mechanisms, conventions. Lorena is very aware of this as well. They have a national human rights program that was started with the Fox administration. President Calderon also has a human rights program. They apply to the protocols for documenting torture. I think there's been a lot of progress made, particularly in the international sphere, and being open to international scrutiny about what's happening in the country. I think what we see as pending is really what that means on the ground in Mexico, and I think particularly a lot of the abuses that continue to occur. And more in the context of this panel and the last panel looking at security in Mexico, I think what we're seeing now is what are the consequences of having the military deployed throughout the country, approximately 50,000 troops, when you have an institution that's never been really held accountable for abuses and that aren't really trained to be in interaction with the civilian population. So I was reading the newspaper this morning, in one of the newspapers from Mexico this morning, and there were 2 articles that caught my attention. One was that yesterday the president of the Human Rights Commission in Mexico, the National Human Rights Commission, had done a presentation before the Supreme Court yesterday, and he had commented that military abuses, complaints that have been received to the commission against the military have increased by 500% in the last 5 years. And the other article was about 2 children that were killed when their car failed to stop at a military checkpoint yesterday when they were traveling with their family in Tamaulipas. So I think the first speaks of the fact that there has been a significant increase in complaints and abuses by the military as a result of their deployment. And second is, in a sense, part of why that has happened, which is that when you look at military forces that are trained for combat situations, so to confront an enemy, using force to confront an enemy, one of the results is that you have these, almost inevitably, these abuses. And I think the problem with that is in Mexico, they aren't being really held accountable for their actions. And so one is obviously the training. And I would say that Mexico has, they just signed an agreement last year with the Human Rights, the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights on training for the Mexican military. There's the training aspect, but I think the other aspect of holding them accountable and prosecuting soldiers responsible for abuses hasn't really been attended to. So I think what we see in Ciudad Juarez and the outline areas of the city is sort of a case example of the worst case scenario in terms of what has happened when you have this high level of troops and federal police interacting with the civilian population. Just some numbers. In an 18-month period, so between March 2008 and September 2009, the State Human Rights Commission and their office in Ciudad Juarez had received 13,000 complaints of abuses by the military. And some of them, 14 allegations included enforced disappearance and 8 accusations of extrajudicial executions. I was looking over the Human Rights Commission, the National Human Rights Commission's recommendations against the Defense Ministry last year. There's 30 recommendations that were issued against Sedena. 14 of the cases are in the state of Chihuahua, and 12 of them are regarding cases that occurred in Ciudad Juarez. And I think the pattern that we see in a lot of the cases are arbitrary detentions of individuals either in their homes or in military checkpoints that are then taken to military barracks, illegally detained and tortured into trying to get evidence against them, which obviously, and the U.S. ambassadors also commented on it, aren't really, you can't be used in court. So it's sort of this use of torture for evidence that's not necessarily going to get them into any legal proceeding. I wanted to talk about some cases, and I know Alfredo's got his other anecdotes more on the journalist side of what this has meant for the population in Ciudad Juarez and the outlying areas, because I think it also has to do with why it would beneficial for the Mexican military as their police to having a better record because of the support that they would get from the civilian population. And I think if we look at the media reports in the past few months or the outcry in Ciudad Juarez of needing to change the strategy or having the army out, get off the streets, part of it is obviously the concerns about the violence, but also the way that the military's interacted with the population. So one case that we had received from a local human rights organization in Ciudad Juarez regarded a man who was detained by the military, stopped at a military checkpoint. He was detained. They harassed him. They blindfolded him. They took him to an undisclosed location where he was held and tortured for 3 days, and he could hear other people as well being interrogated while he was there. When he was released, he said he was told, if anyone asks you what happened, tell them you were kidnapped, and remember that we know where you live. So after talking about this with his family, their kind of solution was, well, let's just, don't leave your house for a few months. And he really, stayed at home, lost his job, hasn't been able to find another job, and is now thinking of moving to the United States. His family did lodge a complaint about the abuses that happened in 2008, and this February he was actually summoned to kind of expand on the situation, and he didn't go. And he didn't go because he was afraid of reprisals from the military. And I think that also points to the fact that there are a lot of abuses that probably are going unreported because people are very afraid of the consequences. Obviously, there's a lot of other cases that don't involve the military, the police, that are certainly looking at drug traffickers committing abuses. But I think this other side of people not feeling like they have the security they need, or those responsible for providing them with security are actually responsible for these abuses, just highlights the need to address the situation and the concern of what do you do when those that are protecting you are actually violating your rights. The other case, which I think is actually more recent, was the disappearance of 3 individuals in December 29th of last year, where 10 soldiers in uniform took 3 individuals from their homes in Buenaventura, which is in between Ciudad Juarez and Chihuahua City, again, the municipality. The family reported the case to the public minister. He had said that he thought that the 3 individuals had been taken to one of the military barracks and were being investigated. And to this day, no one knows what happened to them. In early February, one of the women was able to make a phone call to her friend. She's like, "Take me out of here. I'm scared. I don't know what's going on." And the phone call was cut. And there hasn't been very much effort to investigate the origins of the phone call. But that it's one of those cases again of people that have been disappeared and who were originally detained by the Mexican military. I comment on this because I think it is a serious situation. A lot of the cases do involve torture, arbitrary detention, and no one's really being held accountable for this. I will say that Human Rights Watch has been probably the biggest organization looking at the issue of military impunity in Mexico, and they've been going back and forth with the Minister of the Interior in Mexico about the different cases. And he actually finally came back to them last year at the end of the year saying that of the cases that have been registered, only one soldier has been convicted during the Calderon administration for human rights abuse, and it was sentenced for 9 months in prison for killing a civilian at a checkpoint. So if you look at the number of cases out there and the number of recommendations that are pending to the Defense Ministry, the fact that you only have one soldier being held accountable certainly calls attention to the fact that there is the impunity that we've spoken about for other instances is also accentuated with the Mexican military. Just briefly then in terms of what should be done, I think it's looking at, President Calderon has commented recently looking at the grave risk for society of, the war on drugs and the idea of you needing to ensure the rule of law. And I think the rule of law in this case certainly starts with holding your own security officials responsible for their actions. We've spoken a lot today about the need for police reform, and I think I would add to that police accountability for their actions. I think the same obviously goes for the Mexican military. Whether the military is going to be in the streets or in counter-drug operations until 2012 or beyond, then I think there is that pending issue of as long as they are in such close interaction with the civilian population, they need to be held accountable for what they're doing. And I think it also is that if you have impunity for these abuses, it's there's no deterrent then to stop abusing other individuals. And I think it's like the two-way street there of, one, ensuring that you do have these efforts on strengthening the civilian police. One issue we didn't talk about in the other panels was you have the federal police and the idea of putting the federal police to replace slowly the military, which is happening in Ciudad Juarez as well. What happens with the state and municipal police, I think, is another pending issue in terms of how do you strengthen particular state police, as there's these discussions now of even getting rid of the municipal police in Mexico and having those state police, but having local civilian law enforcement that are much better trained and have the mandate to do these public security tasks more involved in this and slowly removing the military. And the other is looking at military impunity and addressing that issue. Just a comment, there are 3 cases this year before the Inter-American Court on Human Rights against the Mexican military, 2 involving the rape of 2 indigenous women in the state of Guerrero in 2002, and 1 involving the torture of 2 indigenous environmental activists in the state of Guerrero in 1999. I know Professor Grayson had commented earlier that the military is afraid of being somewhat later subject to international tribunals for human rights abuses, and I would say these cases have only gone to this level of Inter-American Court because there was no resolution of the cases in Mexico. And so I think it's also how do you ensure that these abuses are being investigated and prosecuted. The one final point on that was that the Inter-American Court had another resolution, a sentence against the Mexican government last December regarding the disappearance of individual during the dirty war in the state of Guerrero. And one part of the sentence was that Mexico needed to revise its military code and the article that's being used to kind of assume jurisdiction over human rights violations committed by the military and being investigated in military courts. And I think that the recommendation is to ensure that these people are actually being investigated in the civilian system. So I think there's a lot of things going on in Mexico and a lot of, I think, pending issues, I think, particularly in terms of the court sentence that need to be attended to and I know are in discussion in Mexico. And I think it's just looking in the long term, the need to ensure that there are more prosecutions of it and that you have the civilian structures in place between the police and I would add, I think, the importance of the justice system that you can actually start attending to the situation. So I would leave it at that.
Hi, good afternoon. I also want to thank the New American Foundation and the Woodrow Wilson Center for the invitation, and especially Tim Golden, someone whose work I've admired since I was a young boy. Joking. I like to focus my remarks as a journalist covering the border from the ground up, and as a border resident, it's a very personal story for me. And I want to start by making a quick clarification. I was a Neiman Fellow in 2009. And the reason why it's important is that I felt that as being away from Mexico made me much more optimistic about Mexico and about what the situation in Mexico is. But having returned, I hate to say this, but have become a bit more pessimistic, at least I think in the short term. And here's why. First, it's taking, I think, thousands of people killed. Of the 18,000 people killed, I think it's 19,000 now killed throughout Mexico since December 2006. 5,000 have been in Juarez since January of 2008. So Juarez is finally getting the attention I think it's deserved since the 60s when the Bracero program was going on, the Maquiladora program was beginning. Also in the last few years, 100,000 people have lost their jobs because of the crime and because of the economic recession. Thousands of businesses have shut down, many of them moving to El Paso. El Paso is booming, Juarez is dying. At least 116,000 homes have been abandoned, and at least 30,000 people, according to El Paso authorities, have moved to El Paso, many more to other U.S. cities, or have returned to their towns and communities in the interior of Mexico. Juarez may not be a failed city, but it's certainly quite lawless. Just last week, the Sinaloa cartel ordered all citizens or residents in the Valle de Juarez to abandon their communities or risk death. In the last few days, many people were killed, many homes were burned, including the church, and in the end, hundreds of people did move to El Paso or to other parts of Juarez. I know this morning the ambassador said that he doesn't foresee a U-turn in Calderón's drug policy. As a border resident who's covered the story for years, there's growing caution that borders, too fearful and disenchanted, may decide to, instead of doing a U-turn, may decide to just yield and give the cartels the right of way. And we're seeing that more and more in many instances. And I think it's important to emphasize Tim's comment earlier that in many ways Chihuahua is where the whole democratic movement began in the 1980s. I mean, it's where I started my career as a journalist covering Francisco Bayrou Terrazas. So there is a sense of growing fatigue in the city. You know, we've been at this for almost 3 decades now, and we haven't really seen the fruits of democracy. One way to, I think, measure the fatigue, and as someone else said, the growing nostalgia for the semi-authoritarian system is to simply look at the media and look at how reporters are covering the stories. And I'll take a couple of minutes doing this, and then we can do the Q&A. First, I like to, in this part, speak in the memory of the more than 61 journalist murders since 2000, and to the dozens more who have disappeared, and hundreds threatened every day for having the courage to try and inform readers. I also want to emphasize that whatever threat we as foreign correspondents face really pales in comparison to the threats that our colleagues make in Mexico on a day-to-day basis. I mean, they have to get up in the morning and decide what questions to ask, what stories to cover, how to cover the stories, what photos to print or not to print. As a reporter in Mexico, if you want to survive in a country with an impunity rate of more than 98%, you simply can't trust anyone. Because in the end, it's a government that cannot protect you. In a country with so much mistrust that in many ways it's really a war within the government. And there's a big difference if, for example, if you cover the story from, say, Ciudad Juarez or Reynosa. In both cases, you have to self-censor yourself, but there are limitations. For example, if you pick up the paper today in Ciudad Juarez, you may pick up El Diario or Norte de Ciudad Juarez. You will see the what happened, the where it happened, the when it happened. In some instances, you may have the how it happened, but you're not going to get into the why. You're also seeing a lot more journalists who are disguising themselves by wearing a wig or showing up at crime scenes disguised as taco vendors, so they can because there's always a fear that the cartel guys may stick around and see who's there and who may know too much. I'm also hearing about journalists who are hiring freelancers and just ordinary people with cell phones or whatever to cover the story overnight because they feel so fearful. Obviously, people are also doing what they call crowd report. I mean, when they really move in crowds. I mean, they don't cover the stories on their own. Yet, as bad as Juarez is, and I've always thought Juarez was really the closest thing to hell in Mexico. As bad as Juarez is, you have to go to Reynosa to see how bad Juarez may still become. And I'll tell you a quick anecdote. A few weeks ago, a colleague and I were told that something terrible was happening in Tamaulipas, and we kept calling our sources on the Mexican side, colleagues, and everybody kept saying, "Nah, no, we can't talk on the phone. It's too dangerous." So we end up first going to Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, and then from there we headed to Reynosa. And what was interesting about Reynosa was that we were there. We kind of made a pact. It was a reporter for TV, and I like working with TV reporters because it's great to cover a story when someone has a huge camera. It helps a lot if the person is blonde. So my colleague is Angela Cocherga, who is blonde, blue-eyed, and so we said, okay, let's go into Reynosa, and if anybody asks us what we're doing a story on education, comparing education between McAllen and Reynosa. We'll look for the friendliest looking cab driver, and we won't stick around for more than 45 minutes because we didn't really know what to expect. We didn't know what the situation was. So we walked across the border. We find this friendly cab driver, and we said we like to go to a school. The idea was let's go to school and see if the reports of absenteeism are true. I mean, we were hearing that anywhere from 70 to 90% of the students were not showing up to classes anymore because they were fearful of gun battles. So we end up going to school, and we talked to the principal. And as any border resident, once you get into that whole border environment, you get very comfortable pretty quickly. So we thought, well, this isn't so bad. Half an hour turns into an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours. Finally, as I'm walking out to tell the cab driver, we apologize it took so long, but we are going to pay you, blah, blah, blah. And as I'm walking towards him, a person comes up to me and says, you have no right to report here. And I said, oh, yeah, we're just doing a story on education, on kids singing the national anthem, etc. And he says, it's best that you leave now. I said, okay, yeah, no, we're taking off. We got to go. And then I get to the cab driver and I said, look, I'm sorry it took so long, but we are going to pay you. And he says, look, if it's going to take you too much longer, I think it's better if I send someone else to pick you up. And I thought, wait a minute, when is the last time a Mexican cab driver didn't want to make more money? So I looked at him and I looked around and I saw the guy still staring at me. And I said, why don't you pop the trunk, we're leaving now. And get back, I tell my colleague, it's time to leave. And I think just by looking at my face, she realized it was serious. And the camera guy is still trying to get the pan shots and all that. And I said, let's get out of here. So as we're leaving, I tell her what happened, and she says, there's a van going around in circles, and I'm not sure if it's a family waiting for the kids or what, but it is getting kind of tense. We left. We get to the border, and the same van was trailing us. So we finally get to the U.S. side. I call my colleagues on the Mexican side again. One of them happened to be in McAllen and was very comfortable in talking, and says, you're lucky. There have been 6 journalists who have been kidnapped and picked up in the last few days in Reynosa. So that same day, I'm doing a search, and I realized that 2 other journalists were also picked up that same day. 2 reporters from a newspaper in Mexico City called Milenio. They were picked up. They were beaten up. and they were ordered to leave the city immediately, and they did. So, you know, in many ways, we felt lucky, but it wasn't really the numbers that stunned me. I mean, in the end, it turned out to be 8 journalists in less than 10 days. It wasn't the numbers. What stunned me the most was the fear and the silence and the total control that these cartels, whether it's the Gulf Cartel or the Zetas, have over these cities. So I do the story. It becomes a big story in Mexico. That morning of the story ran, I get a call from another source in Reynosa who says, "Wey, ¿dónde estás?" You know, how do you say "wey"? Dude, where are you? And I said, "I'm just getting on the plane in Ciudad Juarez." And he says, "Be careful. They're asking who you are and where you live, blah, blah, blah." So I get to Mexico City, and the same source calls me back and says, "We're getting a picture." Because in the story, we also talked about the growth of citizen journalism in Mexico and how people are getting fed up, and they're taking matters into their own hands, and they're using YouTube and blogs, Facebook, etc. So this person says, you know, that woman that you referred to in your story, allegedly there's a picture that we're getting of a woman cut into 6 pieces, and I'm told it's her. So, you know, obviously there's a sense of guilt, but a lot of other papers have already used the story. I mean, Reforma, Universal, Milenio, etc. So I spent the whole day looking into it, and I guess this is really the last point I want to make, is why we still matter as journalists in spite of all the obituaries that people have written about us, and the rise of citizen journalism. I spent the day checking that out. I'm sending it to sources on both sides of the border. At the end of the day, this U.S. source calls me and says, "Well, it is a woman who was killed by the Zetas, but it's a woman who was killed 6 weeks ago in Veracruz. It's not the woman from Camargo." And what this woman had done was she was fed up by the government saying it's a collected paranoia that's going around in the city. So she takes her cell phone and videotapes 6 minutes of Camargo, showing bullets on the ground, you know, vehicles riddled with bullets, bodies, wires that are sabotaged, and so forth. And she says, you know, who's lying? We or the government? I mean, it was a very courageous thing to do. But in the end, it also told me a lot about how the cartels work. I mean, they were sending that message to reporters on both sides of the border to, again, try to control the message, to remind people who's in charge. So why don't I just leave it at that, and we'll do a Q&A.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a great tour of the horizon, and gives you a little sense of what's beneath the abstractions that we were dealing with earlier in the day. It is so arresting in Juarez. I remember being in Juarez, and maybe Alfredo or maybe John Bailey will remember the name of the mayor of Juarez in the late 80s and early 90s, who was a former Panista militant educated in the Sorbonne. He was the heir to a furniture fortune, and he was part of this wave of Panista activists who came in to government in the late 80s and early 90s. And he used to have poker games every Tuesday night at his house, and he would invite me, and I would sometimes go. And all of the potentates of the city, businessmen and politicians, would all be sitting around. And what struck me then, this is sort of at the beginning of the Barrio government, the first Panista government that took office in 1992, was how well people seemed to get along with each other, and how what a hopeful sign it was for the PAN and for the possibilities of opposition government and democracy and improving governance. I wonder if either Alberto or Alfredo could talk a little bit about how you see the situation influencing the political picture, if you can see that already, either in terms of the nostalgia for the old days or just disenchantment. I mean, Alfredo, you talked a little bit about people's disenchantment with and disengagement from democracy in terms of the press and in terms of reporting what's happening in their lives. But I wonder if you'd touch on that, and then maybe we can open it up for questions.
I think you're referring to Francisco Villarreal Torres, no?
Exactly.
I mean, it is the disenchantment, and sometimes you need to get away from it to feel a little more optimistic. So maybe what I need is another fellowship somewhere. But I mean, the elections are coming up in Chihuahua in July, and that's really the story that we're devoted to. It's trying to measure that sense of fatigue. It's also interesting to see the number of people who are moving to El Paso. And if you look historically, during tense times in Mexico, a lot of people do move to the U.S. side, whether it's San Diego, whether it's Laredo, El Paso. It'll be interesting to see how many people actually go back, how many people have not given up on Mexico. I don't know. I mean, it's a theme that you hear over and over again. Not necessarily the return to the old PRI days, but a sense of accommodation. Because I think it's very clear if you live on the border that as long as you're next to the United States, you're going to have to deal with the market, with the drug market in the U.S. So there's and somebody addressed it earlier. I mean, there's a sense of, can't we just go back to the old days? Let's just let Chapo win, or let's let La Línea win, and not have to deal with the violence. I mean, the government will tell you that so far, 90% of the people killed are victims of the cartel clashes. That I think less than 10% are innocent bystanders. But even if that's the case, you see. And I'll just make one last point. I mean, there's so many tipping points in Juarez. People keep talking about tipping points. Alexia, 2 years ago, the little girl that was 6 years old, who was picked up and killed. She was picked up by cartels. The Salvacar incident in February 1st, January 31st, and then the U.S. Council kills. And people always say, we're going to go back to the PRI. This is just another reason to go back to the PRI. I don't know that that's the case. I mean, I'm not really in the business of forecasting, but it is the story we're going to follow in the next few months. I don't want to cop out, but that's...
I think it was a very strategic mistake for the PAN, one of the parties, to make the corruption and use the fight against drugs as one of their flags for the campaign, for the midterm campaigns. I think this has to be a national policy, and we need to have a state policy, and we have to have everybody rally around the flag. But what we have been seeing and what has been happening is that, and this is also referring a little bit to the government of President Calderon, is just doing this by reacting. I mean, they would come up and everybody can be a narco, everybody can get killed. I mean, and the lack of knowledge has even damaged the president. I mean, the president came out in Japan and said that there were 16 teenagers that had been drug dealers. I mean, then he had to come back and retract. We had 2 students from a university in Monterrey, which turned out they were sicarios, and then they turned out to be students, and they had their IDs with them. We have had 18,000 cases. To me, I think that the next big case for the international courts could probably be, well, these 18,000 people that died, who are they? Because the Mexican government doesn't know who they are. And they need to find this out, because at the end of the day, even if they are criminals or they are terrorists or people doing terrorist events, this gives information. And if you go to Ciudad Juarez, you go to the forensic, you visit the forensic, you just see all the cold cases, and everybody is there just watching. But these things, what type of caliber they used, why did they get killed, was there a transaction? I mean, you don't even have a georeferential map of where these things happen. We've been doing some work with some ONG groups in Juarez, and with this, and if you put them, you see very clear patterns. The other part is the thing of social participation, of these things, of people putting on Twitter or on YouTube all these type of information. It does brings, it's like a mixed sense that people are fed up and they want to participate. But something that's also very alarming is that you also see the cartels and you see the organized crime also reacting to this. And I'll give you one example. I posted something on a Twitter account for my company about, well, why, I mean, it costs probably around $4 million to put a camera and a GPS on all the cars of the federal police. The next day I said, oh, I had about 5,000 new followers. No? And all of these were accounts that we trace back to government offices, to all different places, and also people that are probably corrupt, really thinking, no, you don't really want to do that. I mean, you have a very high-tech end center, but something very, and these are the simple simple police things that give local law enforcement a lot of information. Right now, the secretary of Genaro Garcia Luna doesn't know where his police cars are. He doesn't have like a video camera. And here, you see in the States, every time, over and over, you see all these abuses committed by police. Yes, they do happen, and they can happen in a corporation, but they get punished. We saw 2 days ago, this piece on Reuters, where you had this incident of people in the army making the wrong call. But these things eventually they get tried, and this is something that we really need. I mean, at the end of the day, the devil is in the details. Like Maureen was explaining, you look at the abuses by the military, and you see, well, they're doing police work, but they don't have handcuffs. You have to wonder how they get people into the trucks, and how they get them into the trucks and they don't move. Well, if you are there, well, what they do is, or they break their ankle, or they hit them on the forehead when they get them up. And is it the fault of the commander? No, it's not his fault. That's how they operate, because they're able to operate on a war scenario. But if they're going to be prepared for these things, yes, it should be for policymakers to buy some handcuffs. And at the end of the day, you can give a lot of speeches about human rights, about no U-turn and everything, but you need policies based on programs, on detail, and on very small specific accounts that you need to take into account.
Can I just add
yes, please.
something briefly? I think in terms of disenchantment, which is regarding the justice reform or the judicial reform in the state of Chihuahua. Chihuahua is one of the leading states in terms of the overhaul of Mexico's judicial system. So when you're having transfer to oral trials, a system that's meant to better investigate techniques, you have confessions that are made before judges, you videotape interrogations. I think that the organizations we work with have commented, and other experts, on that risk of, given the security situation in the state of Chihuahua, how many people say, let's just go back to the old system? And maybe it didn't work, but we didn't have this type of violence, or at least we put these people in jail. And in these growing pains with a system that certain people probably will be let go that are guilty because of, it's a new process and training, and so that, again, increases that idea of, let's just go back to the old system. So I think, again, that challenge of ensuring that states like Chihuahua, that are considered the leaders on this justice reform, actually are able to fully implement the reforms and start investigating these types of murders is key in terms of getting that social support for all of the endeavors of the government.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions, I think, in the back. And
hi, Andrew Seeley from the Wilson Center. Great presentations, and I'm wondering if one of you can comment. Maureen talked about impunity on the military side. I'm wondering about broader issues of impunity also. I mean, to what extent are there, we've seen some cases in Michoacán and Morelos and elsewhere where mayors and public security chiefs have been arrested, but how widespread is that, and how much is it going on in Chihuahua and Tamaulipas at some of the places where the violence is greatest? I mean, are we seeing public officials being prosecuted for complicity in any sort of way? And maybe a specific question for Alfredo also, which is, to what extent, I mean, to some extent the narrative you're telling is not the narrative that we often tell of the government went in and sort of shook out the hornet's nest and now, this is part of the growing pains. It's a story about the cartels fighting with each other, in which the government is almost a bystander, and in which U.S.-Mexico cooperation is almost sort of a side product, the things that we tend to talk about in Washington. To what extent is that the case, and to what extent is this actually something about the strategy of going after the cartels that actually has changed this, or are these just dynamics on the ground among them?
There hasn't been any. I mean, there's a widespread of impunity. You have the most public cases, for example, in Michoacán, where they accused majors of being involved in drug trafficking. There was a protection network, and they weren't. You could probably have a lot of work done by intelligence people, by intelligence community, but that doesn't really work. What you really need to have is things that can hold up in court. And here in Mexico, we have this thing called the preventive detention, called arraigo, where you can get somebody for 60 days. And what has happened, most of the people, they take them up, they take their picture. We have these nice pictures where we got these people, for example, the story about El Pozolero, which is very famous, this person that was allegedly had 300 assassinations. In court, he's being tried for 2. And, I mean, I hope they stick. Maybe, and why they said 300, I don't know. I mean, but there's no follow-up. So, and if you're starting to take public policy on 300 people and clearing out these cold cases and you're going to get wrong information. So, more than the impunity is that the work is not thoroughly done. So, I think it's probably also impunity from the state, from probably bureaucrats not doing their work thoroughly. Or people not having the adequate technology, but that's. I mean, I think that the main point is impunity goes along because you don't want to denounce a crime because you'll probably not get an investigation, and then that you have a very vicious circle. So I mean, and this is something that could probably take some time, but you have to start giving very very clear steps in this direction.
Andres, I guess from the ground level, I mean, it seems to be a feeding frenzy. I mean, just people killing each other left and right. But I mean, corruption has been such a part of life in Mexico for so long that you can't look the other way and not say that it's not a war within the government. I mean, it is in many ways a war within elements of the government. There's so much corruption. There's so much temptation. Yet at the same time, I do kind of feel, you know, my pessimism aside, that there is, and this is where Alberto and I disagree, but you began to see that maybe the government's taking control of things because the acts have become so much more desperate on the part of the cartels. So, you know, it's not going to happen tomorrow, it's not going to happen next year, but I think long term, you know, maybe we will see the remaking of Mexico, but for now, it's really, you know, it has every sign that it's a war within the government itself.
There's somebody up front and somebody I think back there as well.
Hi, my name is Dario Sotomayor. I am from Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, and I have sort of a long question to make. But first of all, what we talked about, heard every day. I mean, the whole morning about giving a U-turn on all the things that maybe Mr. Calderon has done and all the other things that we have addressed. Thinking about a change in police, that we say that maybe get police that are more specialized, more trained, something. Sometimes I think that the problem starts on the top, you know. Maybe you could get policemen more trained, but thing is that what all people that are from Juarez think is that the government's being paid, the government's being bribed. So I don't think that the problem will get solved if we get better policemen trained, because still if the head of the police is not well trained and well educated, they're not going to make a difference. But then when we as citizens ask the government, the local government and the Chihuahua government, the state government, they say that the people that are not helping out is the federal government. And then we would turn to the federal government and ask them, well, what is that you're doing wrong, or why isn't anything getting solved? They turn out and say, no, it's the state government and the city of Ciudad Juarez that is not helping out. And it's just, I mean, I've talked with people that work in the government, and they've said, no, it's a federal thing. And then you talk to people in the federal government, and they just, bring it back to the state government. Maybe Mr. Corchado, I don't know if you being people that works in communication or something, do you have an explication for that? Do you know maybe whose problem is it,
or you can, I mean, you can maybe just talk about the impact of that. And drug trafficking is a federal offense and is supposed to be prosecuted by the federal authorities. Murder, for instance, is a state offense and it's supposed to be prosecuted. So you have in every state a lot of overlap. But this goes back to something that people touched on this morning. That Maureen, you may also want to talk about the limits of community policing solutions in communities where people have absolutely, the last thing they want to see is more police.
I mean, I think Tim just explained it on the federal and the state, but I think one thing that we haven't really addressed today is what the whole Colombian experience. If you talk to the Colombians and they talk about law enforcement, they will tell you that one of the main challenges for Mexico is to shore up their counterintelligence. They really have no counterintelligence, and that's why you have all these problems with law enforcement. That the local police, state police. I mean, you have. I've been to crime scenes where the feds, get there and the locals are there, the states are there, and no one really talks to one another. I mean, they're all in their own little corner. Salvacar was an incident like that, where I mean, it got to the point where the residents were so upset that, a quick anecdote, I mean, Andrew Seeley was there and David Shork and Eric Olson, but they showed up and people thought they were members of the U.S. Embassy or the U.S. Consulate office in Ciudad Juarez. So they were coming up to me and saying, can you introduce us to them because we have no faith in the state police, the local police, or the federal police. And I mean, you saw that division very clear. So I'll leave it at that.
I mean, just two comments. One, I think in our conversations with certain government officials in Mexico previously, one thing that we had been told is that where these counter-drug operations are more effective is when you actually have the better levels of coordination between the local, state, and federal government. And I'm not sure if that's necessarily been the case in Ciudad Juarez as compared to other experiences in terms of counter-drug operations in different parts of Mexico. I think one thing. Two, I think obviously in policing, community policing is certainly it's youth worthwhile in different parts of Mexico to implement. I think what's important more is looking at the trust issue or looking at where you have positive experiences of policing at the municipal or state level in Mexico that could be replicated in other parts of the country. One thing that we've talked to different experts about is, are there any models that could be used in Mexico? And oddly enough, the Chihuahua municipal police in the city of Chihuahua is probably one of the most, or previously highly trained, most respected. Is actually the only police force in Mexico that has international certification in the CALIA, which is the U.S.-based kind of certification process. So looking at, they've more recently had challenges because of the violence in Chihuahua, but the mechanisms they had in place in terms of responding to to emergency calls within 5-minute time period, how they resolved cases, how they interacted with the communities, could be useful models to look at strengthening in Chihuahua City, but also is that something that could be used in Ciudad Juarez or other municipalities? So I think also trying to build on some of the positive experiences that have happened even in Mexico, and then also looking outside of that to enhance accountability, having internal external oversight over the police, certain things that would help not only in performance but also increase citizen trust in the police.
Great. Do we have anybody else out there? Yes, back in the very back, and then toward the middle.
Dan Wilson from Zemi Communications. Fascinating presentation. There is a certain disconnect. I talk to my friends and associates in Mexico City, for instance, and it's not the drug-related crime, but it's the secuestros express, it's the extortion, it's the common crime, it's the home invasions, it's that have gotten everybody completely on edge. And in fact, it's as bad as I have seen any time in the last 25 years. Is that crime, which may have a larger economic impact, related to the drug trafficking and violence on the border, or is it a different phenomenon?
Alberto, you want to start with that one?
The crime patterns that you've been seeing in Mexico are very different from the areas what you have in the country. In Juarez, there are most of the crime is related for drug trafficking and for organized crime. For example, somebody gets their car stolen, that car will usually end up in a shooting. It's a small chain that you have. I mean, at the end of the day, it's going to be something that's from organized crime, but like we were explaining, from the local perspective, you would see one car got stolen here, somebody got robbed at an ATM, and then you see they paid that person with the money from the ATM, and you find the car in a shootout with low caliber if they don't want the federal authorities to find out, or if you have a high caliber if you don't want the local authorities to investigate the case, because they also know they also know these rules. So if you want to do a murder attempt at somebody that you don't want the federal government to find out, you use a low caliber. And if you don't want the local authorities to investigate, you use a higher caliber, so it will end up in the merit of the federal authorities. So these are the type of impunity. And you have all these, at least in Ciudad Juarez, I mean, crime is coming to be a modus vivendi. I mean, and people are also taking a little bit of acceptance of this. I mean, yeah, if I'm selling bootlegged CDs from the latest records in the street, the organized crime is El Chapo Guzman and all these other big names, and maybe that's something that I'm doing. If I'm buying drugs on the street, if I'm going to buy one joint in Mexico City, well, that costs around 10 pesos, probably close to $1. Well, that's one bullet for the organized crime. That's the price of a bullet that you placed in Mexico City. So you have this chain of illegality, and what worries me is that this line of what's legal and what's not legal, it's starting to blur society. In Juarez, you have the owner of a car dealership. He was very angry because outside his daughter's 15th birthday party, somebody started to shoot an AK-47. And 1 month ago, he was very happy because he had sold 4 pickup trucks cash, and he was not going to pay any taxes. Well, maybe they use those same pickup trucks to do the shooting outside his house. I mean, so this is something that, as you were saying, you see all of these small crimes like extortion, car robbery, theft, and you also see these other crimes that are also illegal activities but are not violent, but they also help support organized crime.
Great. We have one more in the back there.
Real quick, Robert Charetta again with International Investor. One for each of you, if I could. Ms. Meyer, I think your work is commendable. Are you doing anything to publish a list? I don't think anybody's going to be so concerned about human rights until the war is over, so to speak. But you could frighten people with the prospect that their names will forever be on a list if they are subject to human rights violations. For Mr. Islas, how bad could the risk get? What would be the next risk that, if realized, would really involve the U.S. participation? And finally, for Mr. Cachado, goals. Try to give us some hope here. Look 5 years in the future. If something dramatic happened to turn this around, how would you measure success?
I will start. Thanks. We haven't published a list of perpetrators of abuses. I would say, though, that we work with a lot of human rights organizations in Mexico and have submitted a lot of information, at least to the U.S. government in terms of cases that they've documented, because U.S. law, 1, prohibits the U.S. for training or funding any foreign security forces that are involved in human rights abuses, and 2, just to publicize more of that information. So I think we are working to make what is available public. I think it's hard to document certain cases in terms of the names because they don't have them, but there are those cases that they do have the names, that we've certainly worked to make those more public. Oh, in terms of the type of abuses? Yeah, I think Yeah, I think we have issued different information in terms of like the different types of abuses and the cases, specific cases, but not probably at the level that you're talking about.
I mean, real quick, I would say if you want to measure success in 5 years, look at what the U.S. is doing in terms of bulk catch, weapons going south, treatment programs in the U.S. In Mexico, improving educational and economic opportunities. And the bottom line is really, Mexican institutions, I mean, they have to become stronger. There has to be a rule of law. If tomorrow Mexican cookies were outlaw, that would become the next phenomena because the institutions simply don't work. I mean, you have a very, one analyst said to me recently, you have a very courageous, bold president governing a country with no institutions and no rule of law. So, with those odds, there's not much of a chance.
What are the risks? If we keep the steady state and we keep things how they are right now, if you take a look at General Renard's declarations, he spoke today in the Press in the Morning on the USA Today newspaper, and he's talking about guerrilla warfare in cooperation with Mexican military on guerrilla warfare. Why? Because drug traffickers, as terrorist cells, as companies, and as corporations are working in a more decentralized way. So if you read the interview, and he lives just across Ciudad Juarez, he's based in Fort Bliss. He gives a very compelling and strategic way of how to finish this of the successes that they have had in dismantling these type of cells, and that would be their approach. So you would have an urban warfare, probably quelling these type of cells, but at the end of the day, you're not going to be attacking the market. I mean, the market for drugs is the reason that the Mexico has placed itself. That's why cartels have grown, and organized crime in Mexico has grown in the last 10 years. It doesn't have to do with a PRI, with a PAN or anything. It has to do with the dynamics of organized crime in the world market for drugs. The positive outcome, what I would think, and probably here is where I do agree a little bit with Corchado, is that Mexico has been a country that, at least in the last 20 years, has moved upon institutions. I mean, I'm 42 years old. 30 years ago, I mean, for me to get an American Snickers or an American candy, it had to be somebody traveling from the U.S. Now you have NAFTA. Now you saw these things. Every 6 years, you were going to have a devaluation in Mexico. So everybody would go up and buy dollars, and you had an economic reform, and you had an independent authority, which is the central bank. After that, everybody said, well, the PRI is always going to win. We probably don't have the perfect electoral system, but you have an independent body that's called the IFE. So electoral outcomes are still still a possibility. I mean, nobody knows, and it's uncertainty result after the ballots are counted or not counted for. But you have these three independent institutions that have given at least some stability to this process and the economic and political actors how to act. In order to fix this, what I would say that we need an independent general attorney, a general attorney that will be independent from the president, that could really guarantee, because at the end of the day, this is the rule of law. But first, in the short run, I would think that the Mexican government needs to take this to a national security level, but not just on the speech, but really put the budget behind it. You look at, for example, the Navy. The Mexican Navy is one with the highest budget, with the lowest budget, and one that has done the biggest interdictions, and the one that's less corrupt and most trusted outside of Mexico. And they are the ones with the lowest amount of budget. So you really need to put the money behind the speeches and behind the actions.
Great. Well, we're out of time, so I'd like to thank all our panelists for a great presentation. And especially, once again, our co-sponsors from the Mexico program at the Wilson Center. Thanks very much.